All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Shani Roper. I'm curator of the University of the West Indies Museum, and it is my honor and pleasure today to be your person to do the introductions and welcome and just kind of quickly give a run through for our program so that we run efficiently. We have a very tight but exciting program ahead of us. All right, so it is my honor to bring greetings on behalf of the University of the West Indies Press and the University of the West Indies Museum as part of today's launch of founding curator and historian Dr. Susan Francis Brown's book, World War II Camps in Jamaica. I'd like to begin by saying welcome to our distinguished guests, including Mr. Bernard Janke, who is president of the Jamaica Historical Society, Professor Patrick Bryan, and many others who are here with us today. This would not be possible without your presence, and we'd like to also bring greetings to those who have joined us via the live stream on Facebook due to our limited seating capacity, as well as post-COVID pandemic living. Right? So just very quickly, I'd like to introduce our star of the show today, who is Dr. Francis Brown. Dr. Francis Brown is a journalist and communications professional who segued into heritage studies and then a PhD in history at UWI Mona, focusing on Gibraltar Camp, a World War II camp that preceded the UWI on the Mona site. Her introduction to the multi-layered history of the Mona site was published in 2004, so that's Mona past and present. And it is her work on Gibraltar Camp and other wartime camps in Jamaica that is the focus of the work that we'll be looking at today. Professor Emeritus Patrick Bryan will offer comments, and he is Professor Emeritus of the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He has published widely on Jamaica and on the Spanish Caribbean, including important works such as The Jamaican People, 1880 to 1902, Race, Class, and Social Control, Inside Out and Outside, Factors in the Creation of Contemporary Jamaica, Edward Siaga and the Challenge of Modern Jamaica, as well as histories of the Caribbean Examinations Council, the Joint Board of Teacher Education, Mona, and Aviation in Jamaica. All right, so we're going to proceed to Mr. Bernard Janke, who will be bringing greetings, and then shortly after we go to Suzanne's presentation.
Thank you, Shani. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to be brief, and I will be brief. I've been asked to bring greetings, and it is my distinct pleasure and privilege on behalf of the Jamaica Historical Society to bring greetings on this occasion. I'm familiar with Suzanne's work on the Gibraltar camp. It consumed her life for many years, and I was actually privileged to have sat at her revival when she presented and was awarded her PhD, which must have been quite satisfying after all the years of hard work, running up and down, trying to find people, trying to find places and records. But I don't want to steal any of Patrick's thunder, but I just want to briefly say that works like this add a texture to our history. I don't know how many people remember or recall that there was a Camp Gibraltar. I was made painfully aware of it when I was at Carrimack as an undergraduate, because part of the camp was outside the front door of Carrimack. But she has done an important piece of work, looking at a legacy that ought not to be forgotten. And we would like to commend her for taking it beyond a PhD and actually publishing. Because quite often, PhDs languish in the library and only are consulted by very, very few people. So, Suzanne, congratulations on this achievement. Thank you all very much.
Sorry, guys. Technology is an evil and wicked thing sometimes. Good morning. Thank you all so very much for coming. It's great to have you all here. Today, the 8th of May, 2023, marks 78 years since the end of fighting on the European continent, where World War II had formally started in September 1939. The end of the wider conflict would take a few months more. In Jamaica, hundreds of German, Austrian, and Italian internees would remain behind barbed wire fences for another year or more until they could be repatriated to their war-ravaged homelands. Some former Italian internees who had signed cooperation agreements with the British government after the Italian armistice of 1943 had relative freedom to move about in Kingston, and I actually came across people who had met them on the buses and become their friends. Though in theory they were not permitted to work, in practice many did find occupation. By the end of the war, many hundreds of evacuees and refugees who had been granted haven in Jamaica during the war had already been repatriated. As this suggests, the Jamaican, and more particularly the Kingston, Jamaica landscape during World War II included several unusual populations who were generally kept or encouraged to be separate from the local, still colonized Jamaican population. And their circumstances, as well as the indirect or direct connections they had on the local population and society, would be largely forgotten, especially in the shifting local post-war environment. My own introduction to these wartime camps and populations came when I was researching the history and heritage of the University of the West Indies Mona campus, which included and still includes material remains of several layers of local and regional history, including several aged wooden barrack-style buildings in which the then University College of the West Indies had its start in 1948. These were remnants of Gibraltar Camp, a British colonial office facility established as a haven for civilian evacuees from the British Mediterranean fortress of Gibraltar during World War II. Later, mainly Jewish refugees from Poland, other Eastern European countries, Belgium, and the Netherlands would also be housed there, though with some spatial separation. All these strands now inform World War II camps in Jamaica, evacuees, refugees, internees, prisoners of war, which has been published by the UWI Press. And today my main purpose is to introduce you to this landscape, which the book seeks to recreate and repopulate, and to highlight the consequent gaps in heritage. The first thing to note is that I have excavated a wide range of sources with a view to developing a layered understanding, not just of the official structures, but the persons impacted within and outside these camps. To the extent possible, given temporal constraints, this has included engagement with camp residents and local residents, or with testimonies published or unpublished. I see Ainsley Henrique is here today, and his quote-unquote stepmother, Miriam Stanton, who was in the camp, was one of the persons who published her own memoir, and which was very helpful. It has also involved mining not only archives, but also contemporaneous media sources. Hence, I acknowledge and thank not just the librarians and archivists, locally and overseas, but also a range of persons whom I met in person or via online means, direct or indirect, who shared stories that supported or provided significant texture to the official sources. Because the threads of the story reached far beyond Jamaica's shores, I benefited from persons' willingness to connect me with other networks though I acknowledge that there are some non-English archives that did remain mostly beyond my reach. The book has 5 chapters which consider, first, the Jamaican context leading up to and during World War II, when the island remained a colonial territory within the then British West Indies. Second, Gibraltar Camp, a camp for free Europeans seeking or sent for haven during the war, though the conditions of the camp had some elements described as semi-internment conditions. Then number 3, the internment camps, and there were 3 of them over the course of the war, where a mix of persons defined as enemy aliens, some of them civilians, and some merchant mariners taken prisoner at sea, were held under guard. Chapter 4 considers the extent to which the camp succeeded in isolating the incomers from the local population, and also the extent to which there was nonetheless interaction at some levels. And Chapter 5, the briefest chapter, considers what material traces remain in local heritage, and indeed the heritage of those who spent this intense and dysfunctional period in relative haven in Jamaica. What I would like to do is to use a few of the figures from the book to orient you to the story it contains. The first one that I will show, and I have to remember to pause it so that it doesn't go AWOL. The first one that I will show sets out the various camps that were established in Jamaica by the colonial government on behalf of the imperial government in London, with reference to various other British colonial or allied interests. As the image indicates, there was 1 civilian-run camp and 3 for whom the security forces, generally the military, had broad responsibility. As you will see from the populations of each camp on the right of the image, the second group of camps also included significant numbers of civilians, but these were classified as enemy aliens and hence were detained in completely secured camps. So the population of Gibraltar Camp, that's the first one in the list and the only one in its category, run under the auspices of the Colonial Office, included initially evacuees, civilians whose government had determined that they must be moved away for their relative and or in the imperial interest. The camp was named for the population it initially expected to hold. A section was early expected to hold Maltese evacuees, but this did not come to pass. Originally designated and designed for 4,000 persons, expectations increased to 7 and then 9,000 persons in a very short space of time before a halt was called, leaving some sections unfinished. This anticipated 9,000, I think it's important to note, was around the population of Montego Bay, then Jamaica's 3rd largest urban space after Kingston and Spanish Town. What eventually happened, though, is that the bulk of the 11,000 Gibraltarian evacuees who had been sent to England, most en route to the Caribbean, ended up staying in London during the Blitz because of the threats of North Atlantic submarine warfare should they have been sent down to Jamaica. And only about 1,500 who came straight from Gibraltar in October, November of 1940 populated the upper level of the bi-level camp. The excess accommodation would draw many eyes during the war, and some of the refugees who were subsequently accepted were accommodated on the lower level of the camp under similar conditions. And so I go to the second of the slides that I want to show you. This is a timeline, and I hope none of it is cut off. This is a timeline of the people coming and going inside of Gibraltar camp. The Gibraltarians, as I indicated, arrived towards the end of 1940, and they had the camp to themselves for that first year. And then in early 1942, a number of Polish and then Eastern European refugees were brought in from Lisbon, from Portugal, where they had more or less run out of Europe. Oh, sorry, go back. Go back again. Sorry, guys, I don't know what's happening here. Okay, let's try. Is it paused? All right. So in 1942, we have the Polish and Eastern European refugees. And then in middle of 1942, there's a number of a small group of Finnish persons who had been interned at the male internment camp, which I'll talk about in a minute, who were, if you like, de-interned, and they were sent up to Gibraltar camp. And then towards the end of 1942 and in 1943, we have several groups of Dutch refugees who come to the camp and who live there for a number of months en route to various other longer-term havens. And that's the case, more or less, for the persons incoming. In 1944, towards the end of 1944, the Gibraltarians leave, most of them in a large group. And then in end of 1943 into 1944, we have the departure of most of the refugees. By the time the camp closes in 1947, there are only a few, mainly Eastern European refugees in the camp who have not been able to find visas to go elsewhere. Persons in Gibraltar camp were originally discouraged from going outside the camp and eventually allowed out essentially on day passes. Visitors were not allowed except by special arrangement, which bold print newspaper advertisements made clear would not generally be granted. Conditions of stay included a requirement to live inside the camp and to refrain from seeking local employment. And there were, aside from the bold-faced ads that appeared in the newspapers, there were also billboards put up around the camp warning people not to enter. The second set of camps, and that's no, go back, Shani, one more. Yeah. The second set of camps, those are the ones in the beige or the yellow, were totally secured. The first of them, the male internment camp, was established to detain those identified as enemy aliens from the first day of the war, persons of German and former Austrian origin, even if they had fled Europe to avoid the budding Nazi threat. Many of them were released after some weeks, and most of them were subsequently re-interned in May of the following year, and the question of interning those who had fled Nazism with those actively supporting it became an issue that was widely discussed and eventually resolved by creating a segregated compound for the Jewish and anti-Nazi internees, as well as local political detainees, and some of us might know a few of those. In late 1939 and throughout 1940, these internees were joined by mainly German merchant mariners captured at sea by the British and their allies as they sought to run a blockade and get supplies through to Germany and later Italy. At one point termed an internment and prisoner of war camp, as postal history confirms, the prisoner of war designation was eventually disqualified and everybody was considered internees. To briefly return to the first figure shown, you can see, we already have. You can see who the other camp inmates were, including the largest single intake of German and Italian civilians interned in British West Africa, including a group from the British Mandate in formerly German Cameroon. And these were all shipped to Jamaica in 1940 for safeholding and stayed for the rest of the war, and in some cases, up to 2 years after the war ended. In 1941, a women's camp was established in downtown Kingston in a former Deaconess home and school, which had been purchased for government development just before the war. In September to October 1943, married civilian internees and their children from the group interned in West Africa were belatedly accommodated together, along with single women, a move pressured by German government discontent with reported conditions in the women's camp. So much for the distance between Jamaica and Europe. The next figure encapsulates the locations from which the various groups were sent to Jamaica. And you can see very simply that we have at the highest the persons who were captured at sea. We have persons who came in from Spain and Portugal. Those were the mainly Jewish refugees. And then the Gibraltarians. The dotted line goes to Malta because there was an effort at one point to have Maltese join them. In the end, only a very small number did. And then at the lowest arrow comes in from British West, what was then British West Africa, where persons had been interned in Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Cameroon, and Nigeria. And the final figure that I want to show you today shows where in the city of Kingston the various camps were located. Hopefully you can read it, but just in case you can't, the top purple blob on the right is pointing to the Mona, what is now the University of the West Indies Mona campus area, just below it, a little bit down. And when you have a chance to look in more detail at that image, what you're actually seeing is the actual layout of the camp on the map, on the country map, the city map. And you can actually see the layout of the various barracks buildings where persons were living on the camp. And then just below it is the Mona family camp, which they actually carved off the far northern section of Gibraltar camp, which was unoccupied and which was remade into an area a secure area for married families, married interned families. The arrow that goes straight across from the third purple box is to the Upper camp, and it's just beside Upper camp that the male internment camp was, and there were up to 1,200 mainly German and Italian internees, prisoners, in that camp for the vast majority of time between 1939 and up to 1947 when the final ones were repatriated. And then at the lowest point, which points down into the city of Kingston, points to the women's camp, which was at the top of Hanover Street, where for those of you who are here, the National Land Agency now has its major office. As I indicated, weather-beaten wooden barracks buildings remaining on the eastern side of the University of the West Indies Mona campus and heritage signs and monuments mark the location of Gibraltar Camp, where Gibraltarian and a literal handful of Maltese evacuees, later joined by mainly Polish and Dutch refugees, lived out portions of their wartime existence. They were quite different populations, and they remained fairly distinct. The other camps have disappeared from the landscape. The male internment camp lies beneath the footprint of Jamaica's National Stadium, just north of the military headquarters, though a little-known monument to Labour leader Alexander Bustamante, who was once detained there, might mark its southern extent inside of Upper Camp. The women's camp disappeared beneath the National Land Agency compound at the top of Hanover Street. Nothing but a heritage sign and information now captured here recalls the married families camp carved from the far northern extent of Gibraltar Camp. Recalling aspects of the past has some intrinsic value as curiosity, but also if it helps to draw attention to the reasons why such seemingly significant events have disappeared from sight. In this instance, I argue that the lack of engagement of the local population in this exercise to support the Allied cause, for reasons rooted in the colonial condition, undermine the relevance of this aspect of history to the heritage that we retain. Yet, I also identify, albeit small trails remaining, which if followed, lead us back or lead us to connections yet alive. Thank you very much.
I will confine my comments to 4 major areas. Placing World War II camps in the context of Jamaican historiography, the Jamaican socio-political landscape as a backdrop to the history of the camps or detention centers, as discussed by Dr. Suzanne Francis Brown, and finally, the camps in the aftermath of World War II. Dr. Francis Brown's study, a revision of her PhD thesis, is not only original in its intent and scope,
but also it is a successful attempt to discuss an aspect of Jamaican heritage in the context of both national and British imperial concerns at a crucial juncture in Jamaica's history. I turn to the historiography for a bit. Historical writing on this period has not been neglected, but the trajectory of Francis Brown's work on the Jamaican camps established by the British is, as we shall see, not only original, but also a major contribution to Jamaica's part in World War II. The decade of the 1930s has received almost as much attention as the immediate post-emancipation period, and carries with it some of the preoccupations of that earlier period, including race and class confrontations. While it is true that thousands of Jamaicans joined military contingents and the RAF to fight and die for the empire, the difference is that by the 1930s, an articulate and radical group of middle-class Jamaicans of professional background identified a Jamaican future without empire. Historical writings of the war period have highlighted labor riots, trade union development, constitutional change, universal adult suffrage, self-government, formation of political parties, but also the principle of social justice. Also receiving attention is the imperial policy of selecting land in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean for military and aviation bases, Palisados and Goat Island, for instance. This production of bases to suit imperial interests stands in contrast to the anti-imperial struggles of various people who I shall mention later. Recent works, such as those of Colin Palmer, Freedom's Children, 2014, Bert Tim, Nationalists Abroad, 2016, have continued to examine this period, a period of decolonization. Following on the political scientists can post two major volumes, Arise Ye Starvelings, 1978, and Strike the Iron, or Trevor Monroe's The Politics of Constitutional Decolonization. In 2007, a most interesting work done by Leah Rosenberg, which she calls Nationalism and the Formation of Caribbean Literature, contrasts, for example, the pro-imperial orientation of a Herbert George de Lisser, the novelist and influential editor of The Gleaner, with the deeper social and cultural concerns and internationalism of Claude McKay and others who brought a literary perspective to the upsurge of Jamaican nationalism. The war came soon after the 1930s Great Depression, which had forced Jamaican workers out of the Spanish Caribbean and Central America to face unemployment at home. The urge for socioeconomic reform stood in contrast to what was believed to be the negligent imperial administration. The ranks of opponents of imperial control were not necessarily ideologically united. Within the ranks of agitators for change, of course, is the very central Adolph Roberts, whose autobiography was recently, a few years ago anyway, published, who had established from New York, the Progressive League, Jamaica Progressive League, and the intent was to bring about Jamaican independence. But interestingly enough, Roberts was not blessed with concerns. He did not see concerns for social change as important. Roberts, a white Jamaican, was actually contemptuous of Marcus Garvey's pro-black and pro-African orientation. He was anti-socialist and seemed mostly concerned with changing flags. In contrast, Roger Mace and Richard Hart, and to some extent Claude McKay and W.A. Domingo, took a very different position. Roberts, in fact, was the fallout with Norman Manley, perhaps especially after the PNP's adoption of democratic socialism in 1940. Bustamante, on the other hand, was focused less on self-government than on the collective struggle of labor. Whatever the divisions and whatever the criticism that the Jamaican middle classes captured and redirected the working class movement, the reality was that political change was on the way. Indeed, the 6-month incarceration of Roger Mace for sedition arising from his article, Now We Know, in Public Opinion, arose as a reaction to Winston Churchill's declaration that he would not preside over the dissolution of His Majesty's empire. In this article in Public Opinion, Mays emphasized that the poverty, the illness, and degradation of colored people in Jamaica was a direct consequence of imperial rule. The incarceration of some of these agitators by Sir Arthur Richards and his more tolerant successor, Huggins, at Up Park Camp, for criticism of the British regime was equal to disloyalty, became an important but antagonistic link between the principle of self-government and reform, the collective rights of labor, as opposed to the perpetuation of empire. The Jamaicans incarcerated at Up Park Camp, Alexander Bustamante, Franklin Ken Hill, W.A. Domingo, Richard Hart, and I don't know if Roger Meads was interred there, incarcerated at Up Park Camp or elsewhere by Sir Arthur Richards and Governor Huggins, were neither evacuees, like the people of Gibraltar Camp, nor internees, like the Germans or Italians, or refugees. They're in fact political prisoners who oppose British colonialism. After all, the governor, not the legislature, was responsible for the colony's security, especially in a state of war, in which Jamaica's status as a colony came to the forefront. Governor Denham avoided the crisis by dying. Governor Richards and his immediate successor acted and could act as authoritarians because of their veto powers under the current constitution. The colonial authorities, aware of potential disorder in Jamaica, hesitated to publish the report of the Lord Moyne Commission, which had been summoned to examine conditions in Jamaica. The story of the camps, therefore, intersects with the Jamaican struggle during World War II for national autonomy. In a real sense, conditions in the camps were partly determined by the larger, potentially volatile camp, Jamaica, outside the barbed wire enclosures. There's, of course, no evidence that Jamaicans opposed the 4 camps established in the colony or that Jamaicans supported Nazi Germany. RAF aviator Dudley Thompson considered that British and German racism differed only in kind. The social and political tensions within Jamaica, therefore, form a shadowy backdrop, rather than the center stage of this particular study by Brown, which is focused on the establishment and functioning of camps for evacuees from Gibraltar, German and Italian prisoners of war, Jewish, Dutch, Polish, and Finnish refugees. Ouch. Give me a second, please. I was having some trouble with my printer this morning. Okay. I think this section refers to the defense regulations of Sir Arthur Richards, which in fact were intensely undemocratic and revealed a contempt and a distaste for articulate Jamaicans. But in any case, whether evacuees or prisoners of war, it was agreed that the local population should, as far as possible, be isolated from the main camps. For 4 reasons. First, employment outside the camp community was ruled out because of potential competition with local labor. Second, the 1938 upheavals had been provoked by problems of unemployment. Third, prisoners of war, particularly Germans and Italians, could not in principle be allowed external access. In any case, their internment was governed by the Geneva Convention, violation of which could invite retaliation. 4, since whiteness in Jamaica was not only a matter of color but of social status, it would be undesirable for black people to see white people performing manual labor. In this context, the author indicates that the Italians in particular had very strong skills in construction, which arguably could have been of benefit to the larger community and were in fact eager to offer them, especially after the armistice, the Italian armistice of 1943, that marked the end of Italian participation in the war. But restrictions were not confined to the prisoner of war camps. Though Gibraltar camp evacuees, consisting largely of women, children, and elderly men, enjoyed more access outside the camp than the prisoners of war. The Gibraltarians visited the Papine market, they visited dances in Papine, and so on. Yet even more, but even here, there was a clear preference for Canadian guards rather than colored troops. Germans also objected to the use of colored troops over severe confinement, while maintaining their Nazi disapproval of Jews. If there was a film which had Jewish protagonists, the Germans would refuse to attend those films. The colonial authorities, with an eye to challenges faced by Jamaicans, the collapse of the banana industry, the shortage of foodstuffs, the shortage of petroleum, had to strike a balance between the needs of the camps and the needs of the Jamaican community in the context of continued political and labor agitation. The camps were not to become sources of additional alienation of the Jamaican population. Despite the fact that the sociology and politics of Jamaica was a backdrop to this atypical and partly involuntary immigration of Caucasians, a good bit of the study aims to reimagine and reconstruct the camps with the assistance of photographs and maps, dates in the British Jamaican archives, reports of the Swiss consul, memoirs of Gibraltarians, and the oral historical method. Disappeared communities of buildings, barbed wire fences, centers of religious observances, schools are reimagined in this work in order to study human activity that once occurred within them. The camps established during World War II have all but disappeared, except for a few buildings that are still in use at Mona, and the male internment camp at Up Park Camp, including officer headquarters. The author, having reconstructed the camps, populated them with evacuees from Gibraltar, with Jews escaping Hitler's Germany, and with Nazi and Italian prisoners of war housed at Up Park Camp and a women's refugee camp in downtown Kingston, and eventually a married couple's sub-camp at Mona's Gibraltar camp. Refugees or evacuees who died were interred in Jamaican soil, the Jewish cemetery, the Roman Catholic cemetery, the Up Park Camp and St. Andrew Parish Church cemeteries. Jamaica's ethnic and religious diversity proved very convenient and very functional. The author presents overwhelming detail on the day-to-day existence within the various camps. As such, the study borders on an assessment of community organization. In terms of personnel, there were a few Jamaicans, the author notes that complete separation was not possible, who, having received employment as chefs, for example, received passes to enter and work at the camps. However, the need for Jamaican staff was reduced by the very sense of community developed at the camps, where a system of non-threatening internal self-governance gradually emerged. This spirit emerged, we suppose, in the case of the Gibraltar camp, whose occupants had been nurtured in the same community, Gibraltar. The Italians at the POW camp was largely from contiguous areas in Italy, with a certain esprit de corps developed because of their joint efforts in British West Africa as contractors and builders. The essentially fluid situation developed partly because a probable sense of community and culture, sheer boredom under confinement, and with that source for occupation to reduce that boredom, led both Italians and Germans to enter pig or chicken farming and to indulge their own cuisines. The Italians, pasta, and the Germans, bacon and sausages. By the way, I'm not inventing this. This is all in the book. They also undertook vegetable gardening, but I think that one of the most impressive features of these camps was the ability to indulge in sports, particularly football, I think. and also the tendency among them to develop their own orchestras for their mutual entertainment. All of this designed to pass the time away, because we know that in prison, in the circumstances of prison, we have lots of cases of suicide and mental depression, and we had this at some of the camps, though I'm not sure how many. At Gibraltar camp, the food production brought income to the community. They're selling their products to Jamaican vendors, and they actually reduced the expenses of running the camp. Although not by any means a perfect system, it was inadvisable to place Nazis and Jews too close. Medical issues were promptly dealt with, both by clinics outside the camp community and by resident evacuees or refugees who had those skills. It was the humanitarian impulse rather than the impulse of punishment that governed these camps, a stark difference from the prevailing Jamaican system of then and of now. The Italians and Germans, many of them seamen, others rounded up and shipped from British West Africa to Jamaica, were essentially prisoners of war. They were far more isolated in their camp at Upper Camp and were under strict military surveillance. But in fact, from 1939, all Germans and Austrians, including German Jews, resident in Jamaica before the war were being interned, although several of them were British citizens. Some of them actually held responsible and influential positions in Jamaican society, among them doctors, dentists, the head of Shell Company, and an Austrian swimming coach. Italians resident in Jamaica from before the war were also interned as soon as Italy entered the war as Germany's ally. Like the Germans, a number of Italians were British citizens residing in Jamaica who were interned as soon as Italy joined the war in 1940. This internment of Germans actually was a carryover from what had happened in World War I. Germans were just routinely interned. Hundreds of Germans and Italians from British West Africa joined these local internees during the period of the war. The significant variation between Germans probably led to conflicts and formation of gangs, though Germans reserved most of their antipathy for Jews, who were eventually shifted from Nazi camps to Gibraltar camp, where they established a synagogue. Germans on occasion escaped from the camp, but were quickly apprehended because of their color. There's one German who, we are told, ended up in Montego Bay. How you get from Mona to Montego Bay, I don't know. Incarcerated German and Italian internees were protected by the Geneva Convention. Germans and Italians lived in separate cottages in the internee camp at Upper Camp, but the need for tight security dictated military jurisdiction. In any case, violation of, said that already. The suggestion of Michael Marx in the book The Prison as Metaphor suggests that prisons can be places of relative calm and cooperation, and it seems to have held largely true for most camps. However, German miscreants who sought to escape were occasionally placed in solitary confinement or placed in a kind of never-never land. I think the contemporary studies on prisons is demonstrating that solitary confinement is particularly cruel and inhumane. But that was not the thinking at the time. There was also a threat, it seems, of gang formation among the Germans and a homophobic protest. Differentiation may have occurred between the Germans because of previous differing social and economic backgrounds. The Italians, on the other hand, originated from specific geographical places within Italy. The Germans maintained their hostility to Jews and even refused to attend movies in which Jews were involved. Their racial animus was also directed against colored and black troops who were relegated to defense positions outside the camp fences. Nazism ran deep. The solution was to recruit white Canadians as guards. Ultimately, the order within the German and Italian camps, it seems, was enabled by the greater role that inmates played in their own internal governance, the availability of outdoor activity, including voluntary labor, gardening, sports, and animal husbandry. There's a third camp for women, which the authors dealt with, the one downtown Kingston, which was later shifted to known as a camp for married couples, but I won't go into that since she's done that already. So ultimately, the order within the camps was enabled by the greater role that inmates played in their own internal governance, the availability for outdoor activity, including voluntary labor. Oh, that's repeated. Where did the residents go after the end of the war? The Italian armistice took place in 1943. Whereupon most internees were resettled at Newcastle. They had their freedom of movement, but it's very hard to get from Newcastle to Kingston. As their numbers petered out after 1945, a few Jews went to the Dominican Republic, where they were welcomed by President Rafael Trujillo, who was anxious to what he called Dominicanize the frontier and whiten the population. Most Gibraltarians returned to Gibraltar. As their numbers petered out, a few Gibraltarians, especially those married to Jamaicans, so clearly when they're going out on passes, they're visiting boyfriends and girlfriends. Most Gibraltarians returned to Jamaica. As their numbers petered out, a few Gibraltarians, especially those married to Jamaicans, were allowed to remain in Jamaica. The obelisk opposite the Mona Post Office, manufactured in Spain, it was in Spain, right? And shipped to Jamaica as a gift of Mr. Anthony Lara in honor of the Gibraltarians and in execution of a promise he had made to his father. Dr. Frances Brown, who ensured the success of Lara's commitment, thereby combined her interest in heritage in general and the Mona campus heritage in particular with her academic pursuits. It's a beautiful obelisk. This volume, very rich in its reconstruction of the campsites, should be read by those interested in the history and heritage of Jamaica, and particularly the years of World War II. It should be of interest to those who have an interest in the governance of prisons and other holding areas, as well as more optimistically, the effectiveness of community initiatives and cultural activity. Amen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have books available for purchase here. So if you haven't purchased your book yet, please go ahead and do so. And for our colleagues who are streaming on the UWI Museum Facebook and who will watch it later on YouTube, if you go to the UWI Press website, www.uwipress.com, to purchase your copy, you receive a special 30% discount, and the discount code is 03WW23. Again, 03WW23. Conditions apply. They put that in asterisks for me to make sure I read it. But please, please do go online to purchase your copies. Okay, so we're not going to have questions. But if you have questions, Susan will be around for you to ask her. And it really does, both our speakers did provide us with really insightful information to just kind of understand where the camp was located in the Jamaican context and why it's important to have that kind of breadth of knowledge. So it's not just what happens in the community of the camp, but also how the camp impacts the Jamaican landscape and our heritage today. So to wrap up, I'd like to give I was instructed to give vote of thanks as well, right? So I would like to just say a special thank you to the UWI Press for being willing to collaborate with the UWI Museum to launch this important text. As you know, Dr. Francis Brown is the founding curator and has been a true support in the transition in curator leadership. We also have several artifacts from the Gibraltar period, not that many, but they're in the Origins exhibit location. We have a section that is the Gibraltar camp and the first 33 students. So there are two objects there. Unfortunately, there will be no food and drink within the museum, but we do have a little space just outside the door there where you'll be able to have your tea and just a little bickle, just to do our little lavishing under and feel, and then feel free to come back inside. Okay, so again, I just want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank you, Press, for willing to facilitate this collaboration. And again, just thanking Dr. Francis Brown for such brilliant work and intervention in the historiography of Jamaica. All right, thank you. Oh, and thank you to our people on the stream. Continue to watch UWI Museum programs on the stream and our YouTube. Thank you.